Off and Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to our summer reading series, which features two authors in particular, Congressman Steve Gunderson and his partner Rob Morris. This is a special pleasure for us. We never thought that the first gay congressman to visit our store in Massachusetts would be a rural Republican from Wisconsin. Nevertheless, we are very delighted, and it is a great pleasure to introduce Congressman Steve Gunderson and his partner Rob Morris. Thank you.
I'm going to go on this side. We have been on this book tour since last Saturday, and most people have written their announcement or intros of us, certainly all the radio call-in shows, etc., as the only openly gay Republican congressman, and we keep going, not anymore. So we've been trying to change all that. We're delighted to be here, and we're delighted you're all here. We apologize if the TV in any way gives you the idea that this is formal. We prefer to be very informal. And let me say, if there's anybody here who doesn't want to be seen on C-SPAN nationwide, just let us know, and we'll try to work with you in that regard and be sensitive to that. What we want to do this evening is tell you a little bit about our story. We get the pages organized here. We've been a little bit busy, to say the least. Keep talking, he says. What we want to do, well, you get that organized, is to share with you a little bit of our family, the family that helped mold our life together, and we think is important. The book is a drama. It is obviously our story. It focuses primarily on family. Our definition, that, and really the purpose of writing the book was to make it clear to America that, yes, rural Republicans can be gay too, and second, families come in all sizes, shapes, and colors, and that we want to get that kind of a message out to you. We're going to have some fun with this. Some of it's very funny, some of it's not so funny, as you will see. Bear with us as we share with you a little bit of our book. After that, we'll be delighted to answer questions, take comments, whatever you might have. All right.
You ready for the first one?
We're ready for the first one.
I don't think you're going to know who this is, though. Yeah.
As we say, one of my best friends in the U.S. Congress, Congressman Bob Dornan from California. And it is no accident that literally the first line of the first page of the book starts out with these lines. When I went to work on March 24th, 1994, I didn't expect that by the end of the day I would be outed on the floor of the House of Representatives and, thanks to C-SPAN, on live national television. What many of you may recall is a couple of years ago we were debating the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, and as a part of that there was an amendment offered by a congressman from Missouri that said no funds under this act can be used for any program which has the direct or indirect effect of putting homosexuality in a positive light. The debate went on for some time, and finally I stood up and I started asking the author some questions like, what about school counseling? What about AIDS education? Pointed out that 64,000 young people had already died in this country, most of them probably infected as teenagers. Frankly, we were winning the debate on its merits, which, to no surprise to any of you who follow politics at any level, is if you're winning on the arguments, the way the other side will respond is usually get personal. So I did more than sit down in that debate, and Congressman Bob Dornan got up, engaged in the debate, and he said, and I quote, "The gentleman from Wisconsin didn't tell you when he was debating this amendment that he has a revolving door in his own closet. He's in, he's out, he's in. Well, I guess you're out, Mr. Gunderson, because you went up and spoke to a huge homosexual dinner." At that, the House erupted in pandemonium.
But the Dornan incident crystallized for both of us the need to be more open. In the days and weeks that followed that sorry episode, Steve and I talked about it a great deal, and our talks kept coming back to the same point. If Middle America was ever to see through the cynical rhetoric of the Mel Hancocks and the Bob Dornans and recognize people like Steve and me as friends, not enemies, they needed to know who we really were. They needed to see the myths exploded. They needed to hear our stories. The Dornan incident, in short, made Steve and me realize that if we wanted to help heal the rift between gay and straight America that people like Hancock and Dornan had exploited for far too long, the most useful thing we could do was to put aside our intense desire for privacy and tell our story.
Bob Dornan never knew on that fateful night of March of 1993 that he would be at least part of the inspiration for writing this book. We now want to share with you a little bit about my life as I came to Congress in 1981. As I, like many members of Congress, quickly claimed to be married to their job and consumed by all of that. Finally, about in 1983, I began to really accept the reality that I was gay. And as a result of that, began looking for relationships. I guess most people in any kind of life, gay or straight, looking for people to date and to have some kind of a relationship with. So I started seriously dating men with an eye to finding a friend. I met some very nice men, most of whom were in politics, but nothing clicked. Then with one of them it did click. Matt Fletcher was introduced to me by a mutual friend who said that we had everything in common. We got together once for dinner in 1983, and I found that our friend was right. Slim, dark-haired, and 27, Matt was, like me, a Midwestern boy from a Republican family. In fact, his dad, like mine, was a Chevrolet dealer. And as it later turned out, our fathers actually knew each other before Matt and I ever met. I learned during that dinner, however, that Matt was unavailable. He was already in a committed relationship with a 24-year-old United Airlines flight attendant named John Dent. I soon met John and found him to be a very gentle, considerate, and sensitive young man with a ready smile and a happy laugh. He was also spectacularly handsome, with piercing dark eyes. He and Matt had been together for 3 years. As it turned out, instead of finding a lover in Matt, I ended up finding in Matt and John my first real gay friends. All right, so couldn't have a relationship with Matt. I kept looking. In the process of keeping looking, in the fall of that same year, 1983, I went to... I just pause while you all laugh, and then I'll go on. That fall, after I'd done the August recess back in Wisconsin, I decided to take a few days off myself. There was a friend I knew in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I went down to visit him. But the friend was just too busy to spend any time with me, so I finally said, fine, been there, done that before. I'm not going to sit in this motel room in a town I don't know anybody, so I got in the car, drove back to Washington. That night, by now, it was Friday night, September 9th, 1983. I got home at about 8 o'clock, took a shower, had something to eat, and went out to Badlands, a gay bar on 22nd Street. Rob was standing at the bar a few feet away from me when I first saw him. His intense, almost black eyes, blonde hair, buoyant manner, and muscular build, he made me say that, made me notice him immediately.
It was last call, and I thought he had scotch. Maybe I'll take him up on his offer. We went to his place. I opened the door. I followed him in, and I discovered orange velvet sofas, old lady doilies on the table, dead potted plants, and I thought, no, this wasn't a good idea after all. I thought, let's have the scotch and we'll talk about architecture instead. I left and returned to Auburn where I was finishing my thesis, and Steve called, and we chatted back and forth during the course of the year. And I realized that even if he was a tad bit nerdy, there was something... Nerdy's not all bad. I realized that there was something honest about him and kind of refreshing. What I didn't know, what he didn't tell me earlier, was that he was a congressman. And he didn't tell me that he was a Republican either. I graduated. We'd become friends, but the question was, does Steve want to have a relationship, or does he want to have a friendship? He had never been in a relationship. I had. So the issue became, let's get to know each other. He's also not one to talk about himself. So getting information from him was a really difficult thing to do. On the other hand, I like to talk an awful lot about personal things. So we were at odds there. What we realized very quickly is that in spite of the fact that we had grown to trust each other over the year, there were an awful lot of differences between the two of us. Many of them political. And in addition, his work schedule, which he had used to kind of hide himself from his personal life, made it all the more difficult to engage in a relationship. So I decided maybe the best thing to do, if we're going to test this, if we're going to see if there's some potential here for a relationship, is to get him out of Washington. So I thought about opportunities, and it occurred to me that probably the best place I could go and exert the greatest control is to take him to a place that he'd never been. I had spent some time studying in Europe, and I thought that he doesn't understand the money there. He had never been. He doesn't understand the language there. This would be a very good thing. So we went to Europe. And I was in complete control. We ended up in an island in the Aegean called Mykonos.
I was a world away from the dairy farms of Wisconsin and from Washington's day-to-day grind. For the first time in my life, I relaxed and simply enjoyed myself. Until then, it had never entered my mind that I should take care of myself, not just in terms of bodily pleasure, but in terms of emotional and spiritual sustenance. Until then, indeed, it had hardly occurred to me to think of myself as having real, honest needs that were deserving of attention. In Mykonos, by beginning to learn to think about us, I began to learn to think of myself. That vacation drove home to me in a powerful way what I had been missing during my entire life. And its name was life, and love, and family, and Rob. We now introduce you to another very close friend of ours who becomes a very key player in the book. It was through our friend Glenn that Rob met another young Southerner. Raised in Durham, North Carolina, Charles Ross worked at a headhunting agency in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, where he placed psychologists with corporations. He was then 28, but he had the energy, the ebullience, and the mischievousness of a 16-year-old.
Charles became one of my best friends. He was a tie to the South from North Carolina. He was a tie to happy hour when Steve was running late. He was a great storyteller, and he loved architecture and hated politics, so we had a great deal in common at the time. And we traveled together. We traveled to P-Town, Key West, Mexico, and over a period of time, he became part of that extended family that we discuss at length in the book. One of the problems that we realized early on was that Charles didn't want anybody to know he was gay. And whereas he had opportunities to have meaningful relationships, they posed an even greater conflict. How do we deal with mom? How do we deal with dad? How do we deal with the sister? What do we do at Christmas? If I fall in love with somebody and I don't want to tell my parents that I'm gay, then do I decide? Do I ignore them at Christmas? These were the kind of things that a reasonably intelligent man was entertaining for years. And we kind of thought, they know, tell them. Engage in this dialogue. The long and short of it was, though, Charles wouldn't do that. And every opportunity over a 4 or 5 year period that we know, he killed the relationships and lived his gay life through us vicariously. Forget about this one.
You ready for this?
There are several firsts today for C-SPAN.
It was a happy time for Rob and his friends. Glenn, after his first bout with AIDS symptoms, had stabilized physically and was dating a landscaper named Justin. On the Saturday night before Halloween, just for kicks, Rob, Glenn, Charles, and Randy met at Charles's place with several other guys, had a professional makeup artist work them over, and got dressed up in full drag. As you can see, none of them made particularly attractive women.
I take issue with that, but Steve won in the manuscript. I bring this up primarily because there is a fun story in the book about this, but also because there have been repeated accounts in the media recently about my predisposition to appear in drag. And I want, on my mom's behalf, just to kind of dispel that rumor. The most recent was Rochelle Jones with People suggested somehow that I had served turkey on Thanksgiving dressed in drag. Mom, this never happened. What did happen was that one Halloween, there was a bar in Washington named Lost and Found that had a contest. It's Halloween. We decided, let's go ahead and proceed to do this fully. And Ella, the actual drag queen in Washington who came over, did us up. It took 2.5 hours. I acquired a whole new appreciation for what women have to go through to get up and go to work in the morning. Although, admittedly, I think most women have nails. We had to do the glue, and we had to do the hair and the eyeliner and eyelashes. And we had to do vodka and scotch to make it through this entire process. What ended up happening, though, which we hadn't counted on, was after the 2-hour stint with Ella, we realized we were also hungry. Now that makes for a difficult decision when you're dressed like this in suburban Virginia, and there's no food in the refrigerator. There was, however, at the corner, a Burger King that we figured, okay, the best thing to do was just get into Glenn's old station wagon, which he called Connie, and drive through, order the food. We piled in Glenn's station wagon, which he'd named Connie, and pulled up to the drive-in speaker. Glenn ordered for us in an unnaturally deep voice. Yeah, we'll have 8 cheeseburgers with extra pickle, large fries, and 8 cups of ice. No tomato, Randy said. Extra mayo for me, Charles said. Then we drove around to pick up the food. When the large black woman at the window, who expected a car full of Southern boys, saw instead 8 drag queens in dresses and pearls and kabuki makeup, her eyes opened wide. For the longest time, she stared at us in utter silence. My God Almighty. She finally breathed before gathering her composure and processing the order. What's the matter, honey? Glenn asked her in his Virginia twang. Ain't you ever seen a drag queen? He told her that we could pay in $3 bills. She didn't get it. But then neither did Charles. This one is the tough one. Ultimately, Charles left Washington and he moved back to Durham. He would come back to visit us and stay with a former roommate of his. At one point in time, we were expecting him at our house. I got a phone call from his former roommate. At first, Buck's tone was rather lighthearted. He told me that Charles had arrived in Washington on the previous Friday, had been staying with him, and had planned to move to our place on Wednesday. I'm surprised to see how much weight Charles has lost, Buck said tentatively. He continued to talk about Charles, filling me in on what had been happening with him. His tone grew darker and more somber with every sentence. It was clear that Buck was gradually leading up to something, that he was trying to break some very bad news as gently as possible. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I interrupted him. Buck, I demanded, where is Charles? Rob, Buck said, don't get alarmed. We had to rush him this morning to the emergency room at George Washington Hospital. He's still there, undergoing tests. Buck paused and took a deep breath. Then he said paternally, our friend is very sick, buddy. What is it? Buck explained, Charles had been diagnosed with pneumonia. He was in the intensive care unit. The prognosis wasn't good. One lung had collapsed. The doctors suspected that if they could arrest the pneumonia, they could stabilize him. But they had no idea whether that was possible or not. If he didn't respond to the medication, he might not make it through the night. Steve and I left the house shortly afterward and drove to the hospital. There we found Charles's neighbors, Kathy and Marie, in the waiting room. Before we went to his room, they warned us that he had lost an incredible amount of weight and was only partially conscious. Marie told us not to act surprised when we saw him. Then she said he had been diagnosed with AIDS and that he was in the advanced stages. Sorry, we revised this just a few days ago.
You just talk.
In a conversation with our friends Matt and John, who we knew had friends who had been sick, I spent a long time complaining about the situation and the lack of attention Charles was getting in the following days at the hospital, and probably whining about the frustration at being surprised that one of my best friends was sick and I didn't know it. At one point in time, in the conversation, Matt said, "Rob, the truth is, you know many people are sick. You just don't know that they're sick."
That night, Rob was lying in bed while I was across the room folding clothes and watching the 11 o'clock news. Suddenly, Matt's comments came back to Rob and hit him like a ton of bricks. "You know many people who are sick." Suddenly, Rob realized that Matt had been telling him in his own way that he and John were also sick. Tears began to roll down Rob's cheeks. He told me what Matt had said and what he knew it had meant. I stopped folding clothes, stopped looking at the news, and sank quietly onto the bed, numbed by the suddenness of it all. As I watched our friends one by one fall under the shadow of AIDS, and as I saw my Republican colleagues rant viciously about family values, I knew that Matt had been right when he had suggested that I come out. I knew that I should stand up and speak out for respect and understanding. We then, that spring of during the last couple of years, we had spent a lot of time with Charles. He'd come back to visit. He'd go back down there. Last time he came to Washington was actually for Clinton's inauguration. He loved inaugurations. Didn't care who it was. He just wanted to be there, per se. He was at Reagan's, Bush's, and Clinton's, and he was as happy to be at all of them. Politics didn't matter. The event did. The spring of 1993, Rob's family has a tradition, a family reunion over Memorial Day down in Florida at Panama City. And so a bunch of our friends joined with us, and we all went down there for that particular Memorial Day. On the drive back to Washington from Panama City, we stopped off in Durham to visit Charles, whom we hadn't seen since Rob's birthday in March. We didn't know quite what to expect. Since Glenn's death, telephone conversations with Charles had grown extremely unpredictable. One day he would be excited about moving to his own house. The next day he would be depressed. On the bad days he would complain about the emptiness of his days. He just didn't have anything to do and was often too sick to do anything anyway. Rob had braced himself for the sight of Charles, but if the goal was to conceal his pain at Charles's appearance, he failed. When we entered, Charles was resting in a lawn chair on his parents' screen porch with a tall glass of iced tea in one hand and a cigarette in another. He was wearing a pair of sweatpants that Rob and I had bought him for his birthday in May. Knowing that he had lost weight, we had been careful to select a small size, but the pants still hung on him like draperies around his now tiny waist. Charles rose shakily and reached out to Rob. Rob hugged Charles's frail body and bit back the tears. By late afternoon, when it was clear that Charles had grown tired and that Linda's children were getting restless, we rose to begin the 5-hour final leg of our drive back to Washington. Before we pulled away, Charles's mother snapped a group picture. Charles attempted a big smile, but we could tell that smiling wasn't easy for him anymore. We kept in touch with Charles. He went into the hospital a couple of times, came out. We knew his condition was getting worse, but we were put in a unique situation. Charles was supposed to join us that summer back in Mykonos. it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to go. We talked to his sister and said, should we or should we not go? She said, yes, I think you all ought to go. And so we kept our tickets and we went. On our first full day in Mykonos, Monday, August 23rd, we returned from the grocery store to find a note on the door of the hilltop house we were renting. It was from the house's owner, and it said we should see him immediately to pick up an urgent message. Rob went to his flat at the end of the property, fully prepared for the news. In a regretful tone, the man told Rob that Linda had called. Your friend, he said in a broken English, has passed away. Numb, Rob returned to the house, took a shower, made drinks, and came out on the terrace where I was sitting. I had already showered and was waiting for the sunset, which promised to be a beautiful sight from this hilltop spot. As the sun set over the rocky terrain and the deep blue Aegean, Rob quietly said to me, Charles died. You can't do a book with a member of Congress that doesn't include some politics. And so we now want to go back and tell you a bit of a political story, which became a key part of people telling us afterwards that we had to write this book and tell our story. We're going all the way back to the first chapter where Bob Dornan had attacked me on the floor of the House of Representatives. As you know, what happens in those situations, eventually they ask that their words be expunged from the record. He did exactly that, and then Dornan left the House floor and went to what's known as the Speaker's Lobby. The only people who have access to it are members of Congress and the press corps. His rhetoric there, however, was even more inflammatory. We've got a homo in our midst in the Republican Party, he told a reporter from one of my state's most influential newspapers, the Milwaukee Sentinel. And they're destroying our country, to say nothing about our party. And we have a moral obligation to expose them and destroy them. Well, that set the tone for election 1994. Through efforts of various conservative groups across the country, I was given my first primary since I had run for Congress in 1980. It was a very bitter primary in many different ways, and we had to deal with the fact that they were setting the tone, and their goal was not to elect the other guy to office. Their goal clearly was one of, quote, trying to destroy me.
First page?
Yeah, the 266. There were two people who were very key in that campaign. Laverne Osman, a middle-aged farmer-turned-legislator, turned government official, ran my campaign. And Morris Andrews, who was the husband of my chief of staff, he was really our top political strategist. Morris and Laverne had insisted that I meet with them that weekend. The meeting was scheduled for the evening of Sunday, May 1st in my Ostia, Wisconsin campaign office. I knew they had some serious things to say to me. When I got there at 8 o'clock, I could see them both through the office's big plate glass window, sitting at the big table in the front room. I joined them and exchanged some small talk. Then Laverne cut it short. I guess he said, this is about as a direct and blunt conversation as you and I will ever have. The tension could have been cut with a knife. I knew Morris and Laverne, and I knew neither of them wanted to confront the subject that was staring us in the face. I didn't want to talk about it either, but we all knew there was no way to avoid it. Neither one of us is here to argue about your personal life, Laverne said. I guess each of us has as much respect for you as anyone possibly can. That's why we are in this campaign. And nothing I say should be construed to be negative about Rob. We both know him and like him as well. To Bev and me, you guys are like family. I nodded. But we are concerned, Laverne went on, about the degree to which your personal lives will become the focus of this campaign. We can do a lot of things in this campaign to get you reelected, but there are some things that none of us except you and Rob can control. And I guess we need to know where you're coming from on all of this. Morris broke in. Let me be blunt, Steve. You know I think the world of you both. And you know I'm as open-minded socially as anyone in this campaign. But our job is to get you reelected. And we simply can't do that if this is going to become a referenda on gay rights. People back here know about you, and they will tolerate it because you do a good job otherwise. But if you convert this election into a vote of approval on gay rights, you will lose. I tried to stay cool, calm, and collected. Taking a deep breath, which always helps me to keep my tension out of my voice, I cupped my hands in the back of my head and leaned back in my chair. There's no question, I said, about your commitment. I know that. And I certainly don't want to do anything to make this harder for any of us. The last thing my family needs right now is more personal stress. Both my parents had open heart surgery that spring. But I continued, anyone who thinks this campaign can escape the subject of my sexuality isn't paying attention. My opponent's name was Don Brill. The Brill Parade handout is fluorescent pink, for God's sakes. The only issues they mention are gay rights and other social issues. These people are out to destroy me. Now, we can let them set the agenda and spend our entire campaign on the defensive, or we can try to control our own destiny. Well, the campaign went on, but it wasn't exactly an easy or a pleasant one. Under the circumstances, Rob and I needed each other's love and support more desperately than ever. Yet it was this mutual love and support that was quickly shaping up as the major issue in my campaign, both externally and internally. One of the things, and you've figured out already that Rob hates politics, but he really got engaged in this campaign for many different ways because it was about us. And it was not just about us, it was about all of us across this country. He came to the conclusion that one of the ways he could help, because we were frankly having a difficult time raising money, some of the traditional sources just sort of wanted to sit it out. And so he decided, he asked a friend of ours whether or not he thought it would be offensive if we asked our social friends in Washington to come to a fundraiser. We hadn't wanted to do that, and we finally said probably it was time because this affected them as much as us. They said yes, so Rob put together this fundraiser in McLean, Virginia. If any of you know McLean, Virginia, it is a well-to-do, very conservative suburb of Washington. There were some friends of ours there who lived in a house that Rob had designed. It was a beautiful house, beautiful backyard, would be a wonderful place for this kind of thing in the summer. So they readily agreed to do the fundraiser, got it all put together for a Sunday afternoon in July. We sent a lot of fundraisers, invitations to our friends, straight friends, our gay friends, political contacts, Rob's business associates, and clients, etc. And interestingly enough, almost all of the straight friends sent their money in. They donated, but had other commitments. Most of our gay friends showed up. And so we had what is probably the first and last tea dance ever in McLean, Virginia as a fundraiser.
As we've mentioned, I'm not the most political person in the world. My interest in Steve's campaign at that point in time wasn't the same as the campaign's interests. I thought Steve should just be honest. In fact, I think I mentioned it's better to lose with integrity than to lose your integrity in the process of winning, something to that effect. We knew that two things were looming in the fall. I assumed they were good. His staff assumed that they were bad. One was an article that Chandler Burr, who's a writer, freelance with the New York Times, was going to run, in which Steve's career was discussed, his sexuality was discussed, and at long last he was going to come out. Another article that was to come out was written by Chris Bull, who at the time wrote with The Advocate. One of the things that had happened, because he was out of town and I was busy with stuff, is that they didn't have an opportunity to get together with us and take friendly, happy pictures of us. Chris called one day and said, I'm desperate. We've got to go to press. We need a photograph of you guys. Do you mind if I swing by? Could you give me something? And I thought, well, this is actually an opportunity to assert a nice, happy picture, smiling. So I gave him a small picture. It was of two couples, not much larger than this. How benign, not a problem. When the article came out, what I realized is that they had clipped the other couple out and blown the picture up full size. So when the campaign saw it, they of course panicked. I was the culprit. I had given them this photograph, and even worse perhaps for us, my parents were in town. My mom knew that this article was coming out, and she knew that there would be photographs in it. She thought the timing was lousy, but she was on the whole supportive. She flipped through the magazine, saw the picture, closed it, flipped through the magazine again, saw the picture, slid it under the sofa. She said, Rob, you know your father and I love Steve, and we're remarkably supportive of both of you. And we're glad that you're out of the closet. But your father and I would just prefer to remain in the closet.
The campaign went along and actually went pretty well. By Election Day. We had the endorsement of every paper in the state of Wisconsin or in Minnesota that endorsed in my particular congressional race. So we went into the election night with some sense of positive anticipation.
One of the things that we realized early on in Osseo, Wisconsin, which is where the campaign headquarters were,
Town of 1400,
was that there was a race going on concurrently in Virginia that could begin to shed some light on what was going on in Wisconsin. The ballots had all been cast. We had no idea whether the polls were correct. Sometimes people will say that they will support a candidate because they don't want to be criticized for being intolerant and then turn around and vote the other way. So we thought this is a 50-50 thing here. Around 10 o'clock that night, Central Standard Time, we realized through the broadcast that the Republican candidate, Oliver North in Virginia, had flat out simply lost. And that was particularly significant because there's a strong contingent of rural voters in Virginia. And we assumed that if they could see through some of his rhetoric, perhaps rural Wisconsin would see through the rhetoric there.
The returns kept coming in. It was a very close race early on. I have a district that, to give you some idea, is a Republican. Dukakis carried it, Clinton carried it. At the present time, Clinton has a huge lead over Bob Dole in my district, so it's a fairly Democratic-leaning district per se. So the returns came in. They were fairly close, and finally we started breaking away around 11 o'clock. By midnight, it was clear we were going to win. The local television stations wanted to do the victory speech live on TV, and so we were all set to do it. And just before I was ready to go up on the stage and declare victory, Rob pulled me aside and he looked at me and he said, "This is all wonderful, but do me a favor. Don't get emotional."
Steve won. The following morning, we caught a plane out of the district back home. It was time to get started with the 10th Thanksgiving. You'll find in this book that the stories are all woven around the Thanksgivings and the people that become part of our family as they come and some go, as the family grows. This is a big event for us. It may be our Christmas. There are place cards and there are guests from out of town. 28 that particular year.
One of the things that we always do at Thanksgiving is we begin this meal in a fairly formal setting with a prayer, but we do it a prayer in the form of a toast. And Rob and I always sit down ahead of time and figure out what we want to say in the toast. And then we get ready for it. We took our assigned places. I clicked my water glass with my knife for silence. Then, as I do every year, I stood, looked over the faces of our family, and fixed my gaze on Rob, handsome as ever. His eyes were focused on me as I spoke. Rob and I welcome you to our table. This is the 10th year we have celebrated Thanksgiving with each other and with our friends. As most of you know, this time with you is very special for us. It's our opportunity every year to thank you for your love and your friendship. We want to pay a special tribute to John Frank, who has joined us for every Thanksgiving dinner and has watched this family grow and evolve. We want to remember Glenn and Charles for the joy they brought to our earlier Thanksgiving dinners. They are gone now, but never forgotten. We also want to welcome those of you who have never been here before. We hope you will continue to be a part of our lives and will join us in the years to come. There's been a lot of debate this year, I went on, about family and family values. Some people in our country would look at the people around this table and say that this is not a family. But if family can be defined as people who give of their time, their talents, in their hearts to those they love, then certainly this is our family. So as we celebrate Thanksgiving 1994, we raise our glasses in thanksgiving to God for family, our family and all families. And with those words, I lifted my wine glass, and 27 other glasses, sparkling with reflected candlelight, rose triumphantly into the air. We had anticipated that this would be the end of the book. That was the plan, that if we won the election, Thanksgiving would be the perfect place to conclude. For better or for worse, depending on who you ask, 94 elections were momentous and historic in that the Republicans took control. And all of a sudden, so many things were happening in the year that followed that people felt were relevant to the book, that we felt and afterward became essential. We had, for example, talked in here and felt it was important to include in the book my discussions with Bob Dole about the log cabin donation. So that's included in here. We have some discussions where I have some rather tense experiences with the leadership on some issues and things like that. Unfortunately, while some of it's happy, some of it's not happy. At the end of 1995, you remember the picture of Matt and John. John died in Matt's arms. We had been with them literally the night before, the entire night before this happened. Matt and John had, like many people, unfortunately felt unwelcome in their own church. And they came to me in early 1995 and said, we really would like to have a church and a pastor before something happens to either one of us. And I have a very wonderful pastor in the church I had attended in McLean, Virginia. And so we got them together, and they liked this guy. And after John died, Matt and I and Pastor Evans put together the funeral service. Rob and a couple of friends of his designed a beautiful service announcement and a program that went with that. The church was full on December 9th of 1995 when we gathered for John's funeral service. Pastor Evans gave a powerful sermon, the opening line of which caused inaudible intakes of breath throughout that church.
I'm a fundamentalist, he told us in his booming baritone. Then he added, and fundamentally, there's not enough talk in the church these days about love. God must be increasingly annoyed with those who continue to give him a new personality. The fundamentals of Christianity are summed up by Jesus. Love the Lord God with all your mind, and with all your heart, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The end.
So that's our story.
Thank you.
You're very kind. Rob told me, he said, now be prepared. He said, we're going to Boston. It's a Democratic city. You're not going to be welcome. All right, we're happy to take questions from anybody. Go ahead.
I've only half finished with your book, but I was curious about, in the middle of the book you discussed the 1991 Gay Lesbian Civil Rights Act, or bill that was being brought forth to the Congress, and then you made some comments about the EEOC and why you didn't support the bill. The reasoning seemed a little circular. You said that the reason why you didn't support the bill was because it was not practical, because the EEOC already had a backlog of like 100,000 cases, and the turnabout was about 3 years. But how is a gay lesbian employee who was fired supposed to even have any effect if there is no law in the book? It just seemed like you were excusing yourself in a circular fashion.
Part of what I was trying to show there was that sometimes we spend an awful lot of energy and resources on what I call false hopes. And I felt that even if ENDA passed with a 300,000 case backlog, someone who is a target of discrimination couldn't wait that long to have their case heard. And so that's what I was trying to explain. I've since co-sponsored, and I have to tell you a fascinating, I don't know if it's a happy story. I have told some people that as a result of events of the last week, I am the #1 example of America of job discrimination based on sexual orientation. Some of you may have known that I announced 2 years ago I wasn't going to run again. Then the Republicans took control. The chairman of the committee, of the House Agriculture Committee, says he's going to run for the Senate. The next guy in line gets cancer and dies. I'm in line to be chairman. There's a great pressure from the farm community back home that I reconsider that decision. A week ago Friday, Newt Gingrich, who we have a good personal relationship, called me in his office, and for literally 45 minutes we talked about this, and he told me as a friend, he said, Steve, if you decide to go along with this, right, and I will personally support you, but I want you to know that there will be a major effort by conservative groups in the form of an independent expenditure to attack you and destroy you both politically and personally. And even if you should be successful in that, you need to know that there are many people in our party and in our leadership who are uncomfortable with the concept of an openly gay person becoming chairman of a major committee. And so while I would support you, I personally encourage you not to do this.
Congressman, my question is simple. I am the Massachusetts Democrat, and so therefore, my question is, I mean, not to be rude and to be respectful, but it is essentially, how can you be a Republican? And where do you stand in your party? And how can you stand in your party? I mean, I think I may be a baptized Catholic, so therefore I have that same issue with that Catholic Church. But could you please speak to that Republican Party?
Sure. I don't know if I'll let Rob do a rebut or not.
I may not have to.
First, there are 2 or 3 things. And I use a line that is a joke sometimes in some speeches. People ask me, how can I be a gay Republican? I go, because that's the way my mom made me. I grew up in a Republican family. I, however, deal with that issue, and I think the verdict is out, whether you can be a gay Republican or not right now. That expresses, I guess, unfortunately, some doubts on my part. First of all, though, I don't think you can ever change anything by leaving it. Second, I think if we are going to have this kind of balance of power politically in this country that we seem to be having, it's important to have people and voices for us in both parties. Third, I would suggest to you that I am a Lincoln Republican. I believe deeply in the party that Abraham Lincoln created. I would suggest he is the greatest human rights advocate in the history of this country, of either party. Has the party been captured by some other elements? Yes. Do I think it's important that those of us stay there and try to bring it back to its original heritage? I really do. I am comfortable with the Republican Party on most economic, regulatory, foreign policy, and local control issues. I'm obviously uncomfortable with it on the social issues today, and I'm going to San Diego next week as a delegate. But if I told you that I thought it was going to be a comfortable time, I'd be lying to you. Rebut?
No.
Okay.
Well, I just want to say I have a lot of respect for the way you've had your relationship grow and the family you created. I don't agree with the way you've handled yourself over the years as far as being out, but I can understand it, and I'm glad you're out now. But what I'm wondering is, I haven't followed your career too closely in the last year, and I'm wondering, why is it that you decided not to run anymore? Was it because you were afraid of rejection? Because it seems like in that election you had, your constituency knew that you were gay, though you weren't necessarily trumpeting it, and yet they re-elected you.
Oh, let me just say this. I think the book is kind of trumpeting it to a lot of people.
Well, now it is, yeah. Now it is, certainly. But I mean, back then, this was 2 years ago, right? But, and I'm wondering, after everything that you've built up, all this wonderful relationship and the support system you have, and the relationships you have with the Republicans in Congress and so forth, why not build on that? Why didn't you stay? And what are you going to do now?
Okay. There are a couple of things that have been overwhelming. As you go through the book, you find I never intended Congress to be a career. Never did. I ran 2 years ago because having taken on the far right after the '92 convention and all that rhetoric. And when they declared war on us, Rob and I one night at dinner literally concluded, you can't take them on and when they come back at you, then run away. So whereas I'd intended to retire, frankly, 2 years ago, we made the decision we had to run one more time. And so we announced that was the last time. Now there was this pressure to do it again. To a certain degree, when I looked at the dynamics back home, I came to the conclusion that we could clearly overcome the challenge of a write-in. I do not believe we could have raised the money and overcome the challenge of both the write-in and a major independent expenditure against us. So that was a strategic decision. But even if I felt we could do that, it was clear from my conversations with Speaker Gingrich that if we were successful back home, there was still no guarantee we were going to be accepted and successful in Washington. And so we made a decision for both strategic and personal reasons that it was better to keep our word, to not run, to tell the story of exactly what has happened, and to spend time, frankly, going across this country focusing on these issues.
What are your plans now?
Well, a lot depends on what happens politically. Over the next couple of months, both in Washington and elsewhere. I mean, there's a lot of, I hate to say this, but I think there's different options in government and out of government that could or could not become available. I mean, we're going to serve. There are other ways to serve than in the U.S. Congress. And, you know, I'm not saying this as an apology to you, but I will tell you that if I had become chairman of the House Ag Committee, the AIDS community, I think to a certain degree the gay and lesbian community, within a year would have become critical of me because they'd have said, we supported you to get there, and once you got there, you spend all your time on corn exports and loan rates and disaster programs and things like that. I mean, I'll tell you, the agenda for the chairman of the House Ag Committee is an all-consuming agenda, and it would have really limited my ability to do some of the things in the human rights area that I believe very much in. How about a question for him? It's his turn.
Rob,
Back row.
to what degree do you socialize as a congressional spousal equivalent?
I'm not sure I like the way you worded that. For years, we have attended events unapologetically together. There have been more events that I've rejected than events at which we have been rejected. In Washington, and anyone in Washington who's been to these events know, the worst food in the world is at a Washington political convention. So if you have the option of staying home with the dogs and making a nice meal, chances are you're better off staying at home. That's not to say, though, that at the White House and at other events, we haven't been embraced. I mean, we have been. And I'll never forget the time that we actually walked through the threshold of the East Wing in the White House, and I heard his name, and then I heard my name, and I thought, Steve, isn't this like a Cecil B. DeMille film? I mean, we had been announced, and it was very clear. Everyone was remarkably nice. So.
Was remarkably nice.
Nice. There was a value judgment there. There were Democrats there, too. It was actually, it was a Clinton administration, by the way. Next, back row.
Go ahead.
Congressman, I'm curious about how many gays and lesbians are there serving in Congress that you know about?
More than America knows about. Well, I mean, I'll be honest with you. We don't personally, either Rob or I, believe in outing, but we believe everybody should be out. And we encourage a lot of our friends in Capitol Hill, both members of Congress and senior staff for members of Congress, as well as our other social friends, to come out. I mean, until America knows us personally, they're not going to support us politically. So we encourage people to come out and help them along the way, but we're not going to personally out anybody.
I think it's also fair to note that if we collectively are going to agree that ugliness is acceptable, then we need to be equitable in our ugliness. There are at least 4 prominent, closeted, Democrats that I know of, and nobody seems to be mentioning their names. So I guess the thought there is, if we're going to out people, then we should out everyone.
In a bipartisan manner.
The latest talk about outing is basically geared towards people who voted for the Defense of Marriage Act. I don't know how those 4 Democrats voted, but the Republicans that voted for that, why shouldn't they be outed?
I don't know that.
Since no one knows who they are, we don't know how they voted, maybe you know.
Well, I'll just repeat what we said. I mean, we think they ought to come out, but we don't think we ought to dictate the time and circumstances.
They're actively working against
hurting
our
people.
best.
No, you know what? This is where some of us are ill-informed. Jim Colby does not have a bad voting record. And Jim Colby has talked to us at length about coming out, how to frame it, how to make it as meaningful as possible for the largest number of people. I can't explain his vote on DOMA. I've not talked to him about DOMA. But I can't explain Bill Clinton's position on DOMA either. So I guess the answer is people should find the hero within themselves and be honest with everyone. And I guess that's what we should try to inspire people to do. Back row.
The questions basically have been about politics, but I'm more interested in the fact that you've been together for a very long time and successfully together for a very long time. And I would like to hear more about how you created that world for yourself, and both in politics and personally within friendships and family. I haven't heard a lot about that. I heard that in the readings, but I haven't heard that in the questions.
I know, and we don't hear a lot about that in the interviews either. I think there are 2 points that I would like to respond to. And I'll say, put it this way, incrementally and opposites attract. Clearly we're different, and we come to our conclusions through different roads. There are some values that we do share. I find that the friction often creates 2 perhaps more enlightened individuals. With regard to incrementally, we recognized early on that I recognized early on that the first thing we needed to do was secure some foundations for this relationship. I wasn't going to race off and introduce my parents to someone who a year later I was going to reintroduce them to a different person. It seemed like a complete waste of time. Once we realized that there was a foundation, and once we realized that this might be something that lasts, and I think it's important to note that you never really know. Some mornings are very difficult. Then we decided, well, let's embrace our families. In the late 80s, we spent a lot of time educating our families. There was no doubt in our minds that they loved us immensely, but it was quite clear that they had no clue what we were telling them. So much to the fact that I think after they had a year or so to think about it, it still struck them strange that we didn't want to go to separate places for Christmas. I mean, these are the kind of things that people don't really understand on the most basic level. From that point, once we knew that our families were remarkably supportive, we realized it's time to move out into the neighborhood. Our offices had both separately been remarkably supportive. Of course, they would have been fired. But and so we spent some time in the community then, gay and lesbian community, the neighborhood in which we lived. And it was the early 90s that we started talking, arguing about the issue of coming out. And I think Steve's big argument against it was the same thing that his constituents now use against him. We don't mind that you're gay. We just don't want to hear about it. And that's where we had the greatest arguments. They don't want to hear about it because they're afraid of it. If they understood what they were afraid of and realized there was nothing to fear, then maybe they wouldn't mind talking about it. So that's been the incremental process by which we've come together and then moved forward. Is this a relationship question or is this a politics?
Okay. Since we're in the relationship.
Okay, good.
It's actually a two-parter. One is, before he came out politically, how were there times when you felt either left out, or were there times when you were made to feel bad, or were you included in
There were a couple of remarks that he made that made me quite angry. But on the other hand, you've got to realize, and they're in the book. I made sure that they were in the book. You've got to realize also that until the 90s, and frankly and embarrassingly until my friends started getting sick, I was preoccupied with creating a home myself and building my own business. I think there may be selfish concerns that most of us can understand. I didn't want to know what was going on in the farm bill. So if he came home and he said, "Rob, you're not going to believe what we did in the subcommittee," I would say, "But the question is, do I care? What do you want? What do you want for dinner?" So we had to move beyond that. I could have felt left out if I had been particularly interested, but I was naive enough at the time to be wholly indifferent.
The other part of that is to get totally away from politics. Most couples, I know from experience and from watching people around me, the big problem is what you said about the families not understanding about going separate ways and stuff. How did you deal with the divisions of, I mean, were one of you willing to go separate vacations or separate holidays and the other wasn't, or did you always agree that you would do things together, or do you do things together?
Well, the first time they really got the message was when we announced to both families we were spending Christmas together in Washington. They knew we were serious at that point in time. Second, and we've been really lucky since then, is that the fight we have with our families is that both families want both of us. And geographically, you can't get from rural Wisconsin to Pensacola, Florida on Christmas Day. You just can't get one from one to the other. So
and we've ruled
it's a
Thanksgiving
problem.
out. I know my siblings alternate. Thanksgiving one family, Christmas the same year with another family. Thanksgiving is our dinner. So it's always in Washington.
Do you see the moral to the story, though, that while there's all this angst prior to coming out, after you've come out, you found that it's a non-issue?
I wouldn't say it's a non-issue, but I think it is true that people are remarkably supportive. And those around you who love you and trust you still love you and trust you.
I would think so. I mean, that's got to be a large part of the message in your book.
Right. It is.
But it's, I mean, we were reviewing this afternoon some letters to the editor written. One of the papers back in my district has done excerpts from the book. And the letters to the editor have been vicious in condemnation. Now, personally, I think it was probably an orchestrated event. But they were voluminous and they were very vicious. And I tell you that because we wrote the book to help break the stereotypes. I am convinced that most of those people who wrote those letters have not, nor will they ever buy the book, and don't want to read the whole book, and they don't want to hear the other side, but they're still there. What we have to reach is those one step above them who are troubled by the issue but are willing to listen, per se. We have found thus far that there have been two responses to the book that are very heartwarming for us. One is the number of straight people who have been really touched by the book and have called and written to us, people we don't know, people we know. This book is not meant to be a gay book, per se. It's meant to reach a much larger audience. But second is the number of people who have come to us and said, "Will you sign this book for my parents? Will you sign this book for my sister?" That type of thing. A lot of people, an awful lot of people. We had that earlier today right here in Boston.
Last question.
Yeah. That's a political question.
Bad question. Okay, go ahead.
Governor Weld is probably one of the most, or is the most pro-gay governor in the United States. What could he do in the Senate to advance the cause of civil rights for gay, lesbian, bisexuals in the United States?
Well,
what advice would you give him?
What advice would I give him?
Yes.
I mean,
what should he say to Newt
let me do this. Let me do a disclaimer to my Democratic friend before I give you a Republican campaign ad, and that is that, I mean, Senator Kerry is certainly a friend. There's no question. He's certainly a competent senator. But if you were going to ask which of them were more important on a national level to articulating and broadening the base of issues of importance to most people in this room, obviously Senator Weld would bring in a whole host of people that are not brought in today. There are a lot of, I hate to say this as a Republican, there are a lot of Democrats who are going to be in the U.S. Senate, are going to be in the U.S. House, who are going to advocate human rights across the board. Unfortunately, there are not as many Republicans. And so where we can add to that list in terms of the bottom sum, I think it's very helpful whenever you get a Republican that can be there to be there. Now, you all got to decide the other issues, but from that perspective, it would be very helpful.
Well, and on a final note, I think we all agree, Democrats and Republicans, and those of us who are indifferent and those of us who haven't made up our minds, it's not going to work to be embraced by one side of the aisle and vilified by the other. There's got to be a way to bridge that gap.
All right. Thank you all very much. I guess you did good.